To you, so it has microphones. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry? Make it a bit bigger. Oh. There we go. And I'm going to run this for now. Just again, start. It's default of this experience. There we go. So let's recap. We have one core component, which is div and a title inside. So no props yet. We're just importing that into our app components, our main app components. Now, what if you want to change the title? Then we just have to use a prop. Now, we can define our props here. This is one object which contains all our props, but we can use restructuring to say, oh, I specifically want a title. I'm going to render that because it's JSX. We can render our props inside of our HTML using brackets. And we can say title. So if we have a title prop, our component, we can just render that inside of the HTML. Now, how do we define that here? Simple, we just say the title, and you'll see VS Code automatically is going to see, oh, it's going to be a prop. I can just fill this in. Equals, open brackets, and then inside of that bracket is the value which you want that prop to be. So I can say hi here. And if we render that, you see is going to render that as HTML. So if you're going to declare props, you just do it our components with an equals and open brackets. Whatever value you put inside of that is going to be our prop. Does that explain it?
That does. Sometimes I see that you write like props dot something.
Yeah. That's because what we can do, it's called destructuring. We can also write this. And that's essentially saying that object is going to contain all of our props. So what I can do here is also say props dot title. And I'll essentially do the same thing. The only difference is if we add some brackets here, we're going to say, okay, take that object and take the specific property out of it. This way it's a bit cleaner to code, so we can instantly say title here and just leave the props out of it here. The way we declare it on our component is not going to change. The only difference is that we're going to destructure our object, or props object instantly to make some cleaner code.
So it's the same.
It's the same thing. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about props?
Yes, I have one. Is there a props can? In this case, the prop value comes from the parent, which is the app. Is there what is the grandchild for app? Like let's say another the data is in app and the grandchild let's say is grandchild element is props from app. How can we do that?
I'm not understanding the question.
So, for example, if you have like a card detail underneath the card component, that needs another property component.
Let's say card inside card there's another
Components. You wanna you mean you want to use children. So if I have something like this, and I'm gonna put something here, how do you pass that? You mean?
You put that directly inside the card.
What if it was
inside your card component, another component?
Yeah. So if I have like a card detail.
Yeah, but then probably in your card JSX file or something. Yeah, I think that's what you need.
I think so. If you want to explain it, like something like this,
Yeah.
is your question? How do we?
Is there another component?
Yeah, it's a component I just made it. It's not coded yet.
Okay.
Yeah, here inside the card component, there is a card detail component, which is the grandchild of the app
Yeah.
component. How can you pass this data from app component to
We can.
card detail component?
Well, we can, if we have nested components, we can actually just do this. Just pass it again as a prop. To pass it to the second component. And
Maybe over there to mention, make it a prop and then a card title and a card detail to make it.
Not sure what we mean exactly.
Yeah, make the prop and destructure it inside.
We could,
Yeah,
if you want to pass all the props, you mean.
yeah.
Okay, we can do it. So that way we can just use props here. So we get that entire object of props, and we can use destructuring again. And we can say this, which essentially says, get all of the props from cards, reset and destructure it back into card detail. We're just passing all of those props essentially to the next component.
Inside the card detail component, what you how will you write define the card type?
We can
Use
define it
props
this way.
also on the
Yeah.
card detail.
It's
You
essentially
can-
the same. Just create a component like cards and define your props inside of your JSX.
Did you see it?
Yeah. So I'm just going to do card detail. So JSX. Create a new components. Which also has title. And we're just going to use the title again. So we now have the card detail components. There we go. So now what we can do, we can just use props. And if we want to render our first props in cards itself, we can say card title here, props of title here. And if we just want to pass all those props that we got on card to the second component, we can do this, which will destructure the entire props object into card detail. And we can just take once again, take those props and render them as we want to.
Not clearly understand.
Essentially, what we do here, do you understand what we're doing here?
Yeah, you pass all the props content to
Exactly.
card detail.
And inside of card detail, we can just create a new component with all the props that we need and define those again in our HTML. And we'll just pass those props to the second object, to the second component.
So, but when you define card detail, you choose a specific title passing, and you, what if you use props? So you write code.
If we set props here.
Yeah, props dot title.
Yeah, exactly. It would work like this.
Okay. So the only difference is inside the card, you is passing all the props to card detail.
Yeah.
Is that the only way?
Well, we can also do it manually. We could say here, oh, I'm just going to do title and props.title. This will do the same thing. But let's say we have 5 or 10 props and we don't want to write all of them next to each other. We can just do it like previously and just pass all of those props at the same time.
Okay, so it's more efficient way.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Anyone have any questions regarding props?
Omar, you had questions regarding React? from your check-in.
Maybe I can ask about user interface you chose. I was using Bootstrap in the vanilla.
Yeah.
Later, I want to use it in React also, but I cannot proceed with React Bootstrap. Later, I also learn about Material UI.
Yeah.
So I just curious about your preference or advice. Is it better vanilla CSS or Bootstrap or React Bootstrap or Material?
It really depends on the context. If we are creating a small project or something that we make ourselves, then Material UI, React Bootstrap, they provide essentially already made components, just like you see here, card meter, which we can import, and it will include styles and all the code we need already. So it's really handy thing to use. When you go on to more specific codes for a company or another customer, they're going to have their own styles. They want something really specific. And then you're mostly just going to use your own styles and create your own components. But it's absolutely a good idea for small projects to use a ready-made library like Material UI or Bootstrap. Most of those libraries also allow you to essentially take those components and adjust them with some additional styling so you can create your own kind of components from them, still use that logic. So those are two good choices for sure to use. But it really depends on the context of the project.
Okay. So if we decide to use Bootstrap, if we use vanilla Bootstrap or React Bootstrap?
React Bootstrap essentially allows you to instantly import components like this, and which work in the React context. So we can say have a card, which we can instantly provide some props to, like a title or subtitle, some buttons. So if you're using a React project, React specific libraries are always easier to use. If you're going to use a vanilla JS library, they can be used, but they'll need some adjustment to use them with React specifically. So, but it's a good option if you get a library that's made for React. It's always going to be easier for you.
Any
else?
other questions?
Okay.
No? Then we
We'll
can
get started
start.
for today with the event handlers.
Event handlers or
Yeah, it's a bit.
props? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
because we
Let me
have
check.
hooks in handling events for today.
Handling,
The exercises are reversed. A and B belong to handling events.
yeah.
Well, they both use handling events and
Yeah.
hooks. So
Let's cover about user effects. There are some examples also in the
yeah,
yeah. And then they can try that on their own exercises. They have exercise like 6 components. They have to create 6 exercises. They will try the user effects and use states on that ones, and then we can come back to re-rendering components.
Okay.
Let's start. So wait, hold on.
Yeah, sure.
We can start from VDOM. Stateful components. And then wait, let me share with you here.
Okay. So if I'm correct, you all studied virtual DOM a bit on your own for the class. That's right. And everyone understands the concept of virtual DOM. No questions about how it works?
Just a copy of the DOM.
Sorry?
And the only other is just a copy of the DOM.
Yeah, so it's a copy of the DOM. So React will essentially take the real DOM we have in the browser, look at the changes we have according to props changes or state changes, which we'll see later, and essentially only change what we need to change. If you open your console, I don't know if I can actually, I'm just going to create a quick example, I think, from one of the examples we've written. So this is one of the examples we have for a new state. And what we can see is we have right here just a simple counter components. When we click, it's going to change our value. And we can see if we look into our console in a vanilla JS project, our DOM will just constantly refresh and re-render itself. And you'll see that in the console it starts to flash. So I click here. But what you'll see is in React will only change the essential values in the console. That's only that number. That's where we see the virtual DOM actually working. If this was a vanilla JS project, then the entire diff would be flashing because the entire browser would be re-rendering the page. Well, React only does that value. So it's a quick example of how exactly that works. I also have a plugin because you'll see the board around the components, which allows me to see what component is updating. So whenever I click this, you'll see that the entire component wants to update. That's why it flashes for me. But if everyone understands virtual DOM, then we can continue to hooks. Awesome. So we've seen props and how useful they are, but essentially when we want to make dynamic code, we want to have changing data. And like we said before, the virtual DOM is going to show what data changes in our components. But React doesn't know what data is useful, what isn't, which we need to change actually. And that's where state comes in. So if we're going to look at the example here, I'm just going to quickly remove this part so you have an idea. And I'm going to say is, oh, I have a count, which is 0. And I'm going to render it inside of the count here. And whenever the button is clicked, I'm going to say, oh, that count needs to increase. It's really easy code. So you have a count number, our div with our paragraph, which shows how many times we clicked it, and a button which increases that amount. So let's go to our browser. No problem here. Oh, actually, I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a function which says handle click or adds counts. In here, I'm going to do it. And also console log or counts. And we're going to place that in here. Oh. Okay, so every time we click the button, we're going to execute our function, which is going to increase the counts and console log it. So let's see what happens. I click the button, but nothing happens. While in our console, it is increasing. And why is that? Because React doesn't know that what we just wrote is data that we're using, that we're changing. That virtual DOM doesn't see any change. So it's going to re-render the page. And that's where we have need to use state. React will only re-render components when props or state changes. That's the only way we can re-render a component. So how do we do that? How do we say to React, please re-render this component? Well, we're going to use hooks. Hooks are essentially functions in React that allow us to hook, hence the name, inside that lifecycle, inside the way that React works. It's really easy. Hooks always start with the word use, and we're going to use the use state hook. So we can use the state of our component. And what does useState return? It returns an array with two objects inside, the value and a function that sets the value. And because it's an array, we can name it anything we want. It just needs to be in the same order. So this first thing is a value. We're going to call it count. And the second is a function to set that count. So we're just going to call it set count. And now what we have to do is, okay, we want to update our count. So we're just going to say, instead of count plus plus, set our count to count plus 1. So you see we're using a setter here with our value plus 1, just to add 1 to the state. And we didn't change nothing here. So we still just have a value in our code, like you see here, and a way to update it using this function here. I'm going to run that. There's something went wrong. Now what went wrong is, I believe, that is good. Functions not good. Oh yeah. And now we're going to see something else going to go wrong. We click types. And why is that? If I click here, oh nah, that's weird. And that's because we don't actually have a default value for a function. Between these braces, we can actually set a default value for that state for the first time. I'm just going to set it to 0. And now we'll see, when I click this, it will re-render. Because React sees, oh, my state is changing, I need to re-render this component. And that's the way essentially state works. So, like I said, React components will only re-render when the props or your state changes. That's where that works coming. So yeah, that's this is the most used state. We can use it basically everywhere in React. If we don't necessarily want to use a function, we can also directly call it from our code by doing this. Set count, and then count is 1. Oh, too much symbols here. Works the same way. Anybody give a question was confused about how useState works? Yeah, so it's a bit weird. For the first time when I read React, it was also the most confusing thing for me. Essentially, the useState hook, specific to this hook, using returns an array. What that means is it's always an array of 2 items, a value and a setter. Now in JS, when we return an array from a function, that's the nice thing is we can name it whatever we like. As long as those positions are the same, JS will see the same array. And useState will always return an array, which the first item being the value, and the second item being the setter. So we can name this, if we can name this value or set value, works exactly the same. It's a bit confusing at first to have that instantly getting out that array. That was confusing to me too in the first times. But that's how useState works. And then inside of this function, we can define one default value for our value wheel here. So we want to say here, count starts at 0. So we're going to say 0 here. If we don't fill anything here, that's possible, but our default value is going to be undefined essentially. And that could cause more trouble. You understand?
So the useState is the function.
Mm-hmm.
And count is the value, the number, and set count is the operation.
Exactly. If the more commonly used names is a getter and a setter. So we have our getter counts and our setter set counts. That way we can essentially change the state of a component, and React will recognize it and we render the components.
Don't really use listener.
Not really. React essentially takes care of both things that we normally would have to code in our Vanilla.js, which is really handy.
Actually, this is on-click button, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing we were talking about before. In the next, after a break, we're going to go in more into event handlers, like on-click, because we have a lot more. I can already say React provides that for you, which makes something like adding a listener specifically really easy.
Basically, we are using arrays structured process, initial body first and function that we state body.
Mhm.
And the initial body is initially put is on the we have number 0. But in the meantime, like after the initial body is changed, I mean, update it's like can we say it's the opportunity to access for what happens when like you say like count is positive and then the after 100 of these. There is now the interest is very wrong and please. So you might try to receive counts, come receive the interest body or the state body of the state. Which one is
We can only change the value using the set count,
Yeah.
using the setter essentially. You can add additional logic here, just set it manually. If we say, I'm gonna watch it use effect. Yeah, I can read. Oh yeah, okay. If we essentially add a second button here, and we call it reset, we can do set count instead of adding 1. We can just say set count of 0, which will also do the same thing. You go here, click, reset, goes back to 0. So this setter we can do whatever we like with. It's going to set the value of our state. And we can also use this multiple times. So we can have as much state as possible. Just don't forget, they do need different names. So you can do the value here, set value here. The syntax, while we can set it to whatever we like, etc. Generally, also you are always going to do a name and then set with that name. That's the most easy way to remember. Get it in the setter. And those can be always numbers, they can be strings, so strings or booleans or whatever you like or need to be.
So both the getters and setters can repeat. We have to give them
Yeah. They do have to be unique. Another thing about hooks, because hooks are a bit of a special thing in React, they always have to be declared top level. But what that means is you can only use them in components or in other hooks, but that's more advanced. So we can just say here on click use states and then do something, because that's not going to work. React's easily going to error on that. We can only use hooks on the top level of our components. Okay. Let's use state. Anybody also have any questions about use state? Everything clear? Awesome. A string, of course. Let's say we have a string. We're going to say my name. Let me say name, set name. And we're going to have, say, CUR name. And we have 2 buttons, Sasha and I'm Bart. What we can do here now is to say, okay, I'm going to set name to Sasha and set name to Bart. So now we have a state. The default value is Sasha, or you can also just say, who are you? Or maybe no one. And do 2 buttons that declare what we are. Now we can say, I'm Sasha. He's going to change that string to Sasha. That's the new state. Yeah. You know, C state is something important. States will re-render your components. What does that mean? It will essentially run this entire piece of code once again, with the exception of hooks, because those are special. and recalculate everything inside of that. And the way we see that is like I said before. When I click this, I have a plugin that shows me what re-renders. If we have multiple components under each other, only this one would re-render because we're changing the state only of that component. Sorry. Anybody else? Any questions?
The other thing that I think with the states is like if you have a variable in the function, after the function is executed, the variables are already gone. So then you know usually by the variables. But in this case, I think the state can retain the value for one time.
Exactly.
In the contrary, we say like that is just fast. You have to use a virtual one, so that you have an interact with the slides, that just taking this slow and taking down the speed.
Exactly.
So how can this be compatible? The state remains for a long time, what's wrong, but that is also
fast, yeah. Well, in Vanilla.js, whenever a value would change or we're changing a specific component in our DOM, we would essentially need to run that entire calculation for that page again, or inside of that container at least. While in React, we specifically say this is the state, and only when that state changes, we need to re-render that components, which allows us, if you have like a site, I can actually show it myself. This is just News. This is the site that I work on. These are all our components. So this entire thing, this, all different components. And most of these are not going to change. Maybe we have a list here that changes or an icon that flashes. And we essentially say only re-render that components, just leave the rest alone. That's why React is so fast, and where the name comes from is reactive to changes. So that's where we get that performance boost. There are downsides and upsides to using React other ones, but mainly it's pretty fast library to use. Yeah. Exactly.
And also your state is not going to be safe forever. At the moment you're not rendering your component on screen, your state will also be lost. So React won't save all your states for the whole application, only for the components that are rendered on your screen at the moment. The moment your component is not rendered anymore, the state is also cleared. So it's not saving all the states from all the components all the time.
But if we are very active, this is active.
Yeah, the first.
Yeah, yeah, every time you click, the state knows where this value is.
But if you refresh it, then it will go back.
Yeah. So if you refresh this page, the state is gone. It will only, yeah, React will only keep change. You're essentially in one session. So the moment we leave our page or the moment we close it, the state is gone. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There are certain libraries which exactly just use new observers and more advanced versions of state to do the same thing, but that's for more really complex applications. But the terminology is absolutely right. Okay, everybody understand? Okay, awesome. Then we can move on to the second example, which is another hook. Just override everything. Some reason that's good. Here we have another example. Now we have a nice select here, which contains some essentially colors. And the hexadecimal value of that color. And when we select another color, the background changes. As you can imagine, that is actually a state. We keep that select as a state in our components. Just going to quickly remove this for now. Just set an example. There we go. So we have a simple select, which changes the value of our hexadecimal value. The way we see that in code is we have the state, which has a get and a setter, and the default value of color C, which is the list that's above you. And then we have a select in our code, which is the value color in that state. And every time that changes, that's another event handler, but we'll explain later how exactly it works. We're going to set the color to that new color. And then we're going to map over all of the colors, give all of those options to select, and then lastly render the color to be selected. So that's just another example of how we use state. But now we want to do more than that. You have the selection here, but what if you want to actually show the color? Like, what if you want to have that background as a color? How do we do that? Now, that would be a side effect with the state. And exactly that we have in our book, which is called use effect. The way that works is it actually goes into the component lifecycle, what we call it. We said Bart said before. I'm just going to quickly do lifecycle because I have an image of this already. There we go. Which is this. Every component in React goes through the same life cycle. And it's 4 really easy steps actually. It's initialization, sorry. What it does in that step is essentially going to see, oh, I have my props and I have my default values for my state. I'm going to take those and I'm going to remember those. I'm going to set those. And then we have mounting. That's the first time a component actually renders. So if we launch a page here, I just left already here. You can refresh. First time it mounts. Actually, I can show that thing with the plugin again. Knowledge forms. Oh, shouldn't show it. Let's do it. The first time we start our page, it's going to mount that component. It's going to say, oh, I need to start that. It's going to run the code for the first time. So mounting start, essentially. And then we have updation. What that will do is going to update the components every time our state changes. That's either our props or our state, from use state. You saw that before as clicking the button from a counter or selecting another value in the select field. It's going to re-render that component again. And then unmounting, like Bart said before, our components aren't always going to be rendered. Think about back to this site that we go down the page and this one is rendered, or we only show certain articles when you press a button. Components are going to go and are going to come back. That's how React works. That's where unmounting comes in. We're going to remove that component from DOM, going to forget about the state, no longer use it. That's the entire life cycle of React, 4 steps essentially. What if we want to do a certain action when one of those states happen? And that's when use effect comes in. Because what we're doing here is an update stage each time. You can select something, the state changes, React sees an update, it's going to read over component. So we want to do something when our components updates. How do we do that? Well, we use the use effect hook. Really simple. We say use effect here. And what does use effect do? It takes a function that it needs to execute when your component has changes. So we see here, oh, we want to do documents, or it's window, I think, documents, body, background color, background, slide, background color. And we're going to make that into our color. Really easy. Now we see, oh, whenever I change this,
It is
oh, it might be because it's the same thing. What did I do wrong here?
background component.
Should be color map. I quickly just reverse it to what it was. See what I did wrong here. Ah, it's style background, it's not background color. Okay. So I'm just gonna remove this for now. Mistake on my part. So every time our state changes, it's gonna re-render, it's gonna change that color. Really nice, that a side effect on our state. But now we do have a problem. Let's say we have a button. Let's see, we add a button here. And every time the button is clicked, I'm going to have the second state here. We're going to add our old counter back. Set this to 0. And every time we click this button, we are going to increase the counts. So just like last example. We're also gonna render that. Put this one over here. Okay. So we have our fix it and this one should be fine.
Event.
I think. Bit of a spelling mistake there. So we have our button, we changed our state. But now something goes wrong because every time we click that button, our state changes. So React sees an update and we render component. But what we see in the console is it also uses that side effect because it sees that the state changes. So every time I click this button, it's also changing the background to the same color, which performance-wise is not good. If we have hundreds of those components on the same page, that's going to cause problem because they're just going to change something that doesn't need to be changed. So we can go back to our use effects, and we have a second parameter, which is called the dependency array, which is this guy here. And what's that going to say to our use effects? It's going to say only execute this function when a value in your dependency array changes. And we can essentially do either this, just leave it like that. What's going to happen there, it's only going to run this effect when the component mounts, because use effect will always run on mount, always. So now if I change this, nothing changes because only our use effect will run on mount. But if we want to change specifically when our color state reacts, all we have to do is add color to the array. And now this will only run when our select changes, but not if I click this and change another state. You see, it doesn't console log that anymore. So use effect is essentially just a hook that allows us to hook, again that name, into the life cycle of our components and do essentially some action, essentially a side effect. It's very important that's the side effect and not a main effect. Whenever our state of our components change. And the value we can put in there, that can be whatever, it can be a prop, a state, or something that we change inside of our components. Makes it really easy to do certain actions when data changes. Most commonly used, like I said, when data changes, also to do something only on startup. If you do something in Vanilla.js, most of the time you have to have like a mount a variable, only do it once and then change the mount variable to make sure it doesn't happen again. what you have to do here, just make use effects and don't have anything inside of that array. It'll only run once. Really handy if you need to load in data for an API, let's say. So it's something that only sample once. So does everybody understand what use effect does? Any questions regarding how it works?
Yeah, one more example is useful.
Let's see what else could we show. So we have a color here. Let's change this to change color. Change color. Let's see, we have a second use effect. You can always use multiple hooks in the same components. Specifically for use effect will run in order that you write. So it always will do the first one and then the second one. It's good to know. Another example is if our count changes. Let's say we have count, and if our count is bigger than 0, as 10, or equals as 10, then we're going to do style dot color equals red. What's this going to do? It's going to check our count state, and then when our count is bigger than 10 or the same as 10, it's going to change the text color to red. And again, there's another side effect of an action. So add. Now, like you see, it will change the effect. And then only because we said here, only use count as the dependency array. It will only do that when we press our add, and not when we change our select here, because that's a different state, and it will not look at that. Does it make it a bit more clear? Okay. Any more questions?
So you can have several states.
Essentially, yeah. You can have as much states as you like, as much use effects as you like. There are also other hooks, those are more advanced. There are essential rules to hooks, and they are really easy to find because React displays them. Only call hooks on the top level, most important one. You can't use them as a normal function. Only use them in components, essentially, the top components. With the exception of custom hooks. Now, that's a more advanced thing. We can write our own hooks if we like. So the also ways that you start with use, and those can contain states. That's a bit more advanced. We don't think we're going to cover it today, but think of it as we can create a use count hook that will automatically do all the logic we have for our count and just return the value, something like that. And we can actually essentially add states to our functions, which is a really handy thing to have, but again, more advanced. So this is certainly a good read if you want to have more information about hooks. This is probably the most useful thing you're going to use in React hooks. It's used by us daily, so good thing to know.
Two small questions that are just about the same notes. First of all, why do you return the elements inside of this kind of empty HTML in the 11.4? Like empty divs, what is that?
React can only, or components can only return essentially one element. And sometimes we need it to be more elements. Think about if you're mapping over an array and you just want a list of items, you wouldn't want a container item. A bit of a cheaty, but the standard way to do it is to return empty elements. React will see that as one component, but we don't render that as one component. It will render that as each function inside. If we remove this, you'll see that React's gonna start complaining because JSX elements just only return one element. So it's essentially a bit of a cheat. The way React renders that is as a fragment. You can also just do it like this, which is essentially the same thing. React will not render that, but this is just a shorthand to say this is supposed to be nothing, essentially. So
it will not appear at all.
It will not appear at all as a div or something in your browser.
And then the second question is, with the use effects, you manipulated the style.
Mhm.
In CSS stuff. Is that, if you were actually doing this on a project or like not for demonstration, this is how you literally can change the class or something?
That's a good question. I wouldn't do it like this. This is essentially a really easy way to just go into the document and change the styling. What we normally would do, either you would change your classes. So we would essentially add a state, like you see here, and I would say, oh, this is supposed to be class name, which is, let's say, count is bigger than 1, some kind of condition, essentially, and then return class 1 or class 2. So conditional class names, essentially. That's one way to do it. The way we do it at my project is with a thing called style components. It's a library which allows you to really easily change styling by definition of state or props, which is another whole thing. You can learn that documentation on the website. We need to know. But your question, like you said here, this is just for demonstration purposes. We would normally just do conditional styling or a more specific way, but that's in the constant context of the project.
Any questions?
Without using the color, state is very obvious. So why don't we do that without getting started?
We can absolutely do that. This is just an example, just to use effect to see the way we're going to. If we, how do we do that? That's like you said before, what we can do is say here, class name, I'll give an example. If our color, we can, or actually we can just use styles, that's right. Style. Styles in React, that's more specific thing. Always use that camel case kind of styling. So instead of, let's say, just say background color, we don't type like this. We type like this, which is a bit of an important one. And we can essentially just say color. Now I do have to remember I'm inside of my component here, so it's only going to change the select itself. Of course, I'll just the same colors. I'll remove this one for now. Whoops. Like you see here, nice one, that's it. But that's absolutely true. You can just use those values because it's state. You can just change it inside of that style. It's absolutely possible. The cleanest way to work with this is always using conditional class names. So defining or styling in your CSS, and then just saying here, oh, my class name should be different depending on my state, or a more advanced way with style components or library. But again, small project, big projects, they do it differently. But if you want to have a quick styling, this is the way to go. That's for sure.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Is it clear for you guys between use effect, use state, and props?
Any other questions regarding anything React?
Actually, I can follow up about receiving the parameter of the use effect.
The dependency array. This.
Yeah, and we can add more.
Sure, of course. So the dependency array, like the name says, make sure that your use effect is only going to be dependent on a specific value. So use effect will normally render every time your component changes. So let's say my prop changes or my state changes, then my use effect will run. But we don't always want that to run. I don't want to change the background of the color of the background every time I click a button, because that we don't need to do that. It would be wasted performance. So what we can do is add the dependency array, and every value I add to that array will essentially say that the use effects only run that function when that specific value changes. So like I said here,
Value.
we can add more values. So we can essentially say here, not only counts, but also color. We can add multiple values to use effects. One thing that I forgot to mention that's also important, we can call hooks inside of these effects, like set counts to 5, let's say. I have my thing. So let's set count to 5. Does anybody see a problem with this? Because this is going to cause an issue. What do you think will happen when I run this program? Exactly. We have an infinite loop. We have an infinite loop here because our component is going to react on mounts like it always does. It's going to set the counts, and the use effect is going to say, "Oh, my count changed," and it's going to run that again, and it's going to keep running that. And so when your program crashes, first thing we look at is use effect always, because mainly the issues will be there. So you can change state, you can call other hooks inside of use effect. Just make sure that you don't cause a loop. That's an important one.
This part is clear. About the every time blocks or a state change use exactly the code. How can you find that from this code? How use effect the code?
How use effects?
The code, the execute.
Yeah.
I can't find
Where, yeah,
probably if I call a function.
she sees it as a function, and where do you call it inside the component?
Yeah. So use effect specifically, right? Yeah. So because use effect is a hook, it's another special one. It will essentially React will take care of that in background. So if React sees use effect function, it will take care of the whole logic behind this in the background to say, oh, I only need to see whenever value changes or whenever my component renders. So it doesn't specifically get called. It's just a specific thing that React does, just like you state. So that's the thing with hooks. That's really specific to this.
So you just write code in use effect, and you don't specifically call it somewhere in your code.
Exactly.
React will do this code encryption.
Yeah. So like I said, normally we would always call functions inside of our code or as in the events. But use effect is special. It will only execute when certain life cycles actions take place. So when the component mounts, when a value of your state changes in your dependency array, this is a specific thing with use effect. We don't call it directly. No problem. Anybody else have a question?
May I take a picture?
Yes, we can take a small break. I'll pause this. Oh, okay, yeah.
Or maybe you should
Sasha's
in front of the.
Yeah, maybe first take the picture of the screen and then.
No, you can
Okay.
come together all together before.
Come on, all of you.
Deze collega's ik nog net.
Die moeten zoeken. Ja, dat is cool. Dat zijn we. Ja, we hebben dat zo gevonden die moeten.
Let's make it tight. Yeah, the shortest ones in front, me and you. Me. Yes, everyone is in. Yes.
I take some more. I'm sure I have one with one. Okay.
Thank you.
to visualize your React hooks, there is a link on the suggested studies. You can copy your codes over there and see how the hooks are working. Check out those suggested studies. Exercises you can find anywhere on the media. And also there are React tutorials that we have included on the suggested studies for use effects and others. Extra thing to try to add use effects and use state on your deliverable. This will be the phase 2 of it. As you can see, wait, let me check. On the movie list MD, the second is filter the movies. So using use effects and use state, try to filter your movies.
The deliverable is one of the exercises.
Yes, but there is one deliverable and lots of exercises. Yes, 6 exercises, but one deliverable. The exercises are more static ones. So if you can use a state or use effect on them, try to exercise that on the exercises. But the deliverable needs the second phase of the deliverable is filter the movies. So by using filter the movies, try to add use effects and use state on the deliverable. Shall we take a bit break and come back at 10 to 2?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Let's take a break and then we'll come back at 10 to 2. Yeah.
Are you on meeting?
Okay. So
I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to check on that after this.
All right.
So we have seen state and hooks. Now, the next thing we can see is event handlers. Now, we saw some of those already, on click and on change in the examples that we just saw now. And actually, they're really simple. React provides us with functions that on specific elements, listeners, for events essentially, that we can use to do execute functions when certain actions happen. So think on click, on change, on hover, on mouse enter, which are these ones? Now, one specific thing important in React is that functions are also values. So that's the thing that gets confused a lot. Is if I go here, I'm going to function here, I'm going to remove most of this. This is an example. I'm going to return diff. So let's say we have a function, say hello, which returns hi. And we have also a value called hello, which is also hi. Now, if we console log these, so console log say hello, and I'm going to console log that itself. What do you think will log here when I log these values?
First one will just return the function.
Exactly. So that's an important thing. The reason I'm saying this. When I log these, like I said, it'll actually just log the function, and second one will just be a value. While when I add this, what would it log now? Exactly. The reason I'm telling you this is that we can pass functions as values, which is an important thing in React. Which means we can add functions to our props because they're values. And that's a really handy thing to add. So how do I think I'll best explain this? We're gonna take our first example, the counter again. Copy this over. Go. So we have our counter again. Let's say we split these up into two components. So we have components. I'm just going to add it in here for the counter itself, and we have a button.
TS.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. We use TypeScript on our project, and then you have TSX, so that's fine. So we rename. Oh yeah.
You can rename it, no?
Sorry, the zoom overlay was over it. There we go. Two of our button. What will that return? An easy function that is a button which has no click. Actually, swing that prop. So we can make this function. Let's put that on click for now. Let's have a counter which is just our counter itself. Which has counts. That's a problem. And an app, which is going to return those two. Counter and below that, button. Oh, it's not the default export. So we have, we still add a title to our button. Remember, this is just a prop. So we have two components, one here and one here. Just split those two into two components. Now we have a problem here because we want to essentially communicate between those components. Because we need to add a number to the other components while pressing the button. So how do we do that? How do we communicate between those two? That's where those functions come. What we can do is pass, instead of the normal value, a function, because functions are also values. And we can say here, whenever I click this button, execute that function. So we're essentially just passing a function as a value. In our app. Now, how are we going to use that? It's really quite simple. I'm going to create a use state here, which is our count and our set count. Use state, which is here.
Import.
There we go. So now we essentially extracted our state from those components, so we can use them in both of our components. So how do we do that now? In counter, that explicit count, just a value. So, okay, that's easy. We can just pass our counts to that function. There we go. So that's going to be right. But now how do we make sure that when our button is pressed, we add to that count, add to our state? That's really easy because now we have that handle click prop. And we can just pass it the function. So here we can say on click. I'm going to make sure it's not the same name as, it's a bit important actually. I'm going to say handle click here. The reason why is on click is an event listener. So React might confuse between a prop and the event listener. So, handle click. Now we can just pass our function through here. So I'm just going to say here, set count plus 1. So what happens here is we're passing a function as a prop. And when button gets our function here, which is set count plus 1, it's going to just make sure it executes that when our button is pressed. This is the way we actually essentially communicate between components by extracting state, extracting those functions, and passing them through as props. That's how we can communicate with our components. When we go here, you'll see when I click, and that's it, our components. That's basically allows, like I said, to communicate between components. Because functions are also values, we can pass them as props, which makes it really useful to, like you see here, create a generic button components and allow it to do anything on click because we can just pass it as an argument beyond click. Is it a bit clear on how this works? This might be a bit confusing at first, functions. But yeah, remember values, functions are also values. So we can pass them as props and execute them wherever we like.
So see that handle click, the set count, see it as a pure function, and you want to pass it somewhere on your component, because we have to separate our logic. Basically, when we were doing separation of concert, separate our pure logic, pure functions, and HTML, CSS, everything. Just see it as that. So you can import your pure function and pass it through the parameter.
So if your function is like a little bit more complicated than that, or maybe other functions or something, like you wouldn't write it in line like this. How would you write it?
You can name it anything because it's a value. You can just say update count, let's say. We're creating a function here, and we can just, like we did here, do our logic exactly, and we can pass it as a value. Make sure you always pass functions as values and not like this, because the reason is when we render our components, React is going to see this and it's going to say, oh, that's not a value, it's a function. I need to execute that. So that's not going to work. But we can do this because we just pass in the value, and the button is going to get that value and say, oh, that's a function, I can execute that on click. That's the way we essentially extract state from components and allow them to communicate with each other. A common thing where this is used, think about a shopping cart on a website, because most of the time your components in which you confirm your order and your actual list of items are different components, and you want those two to communicate. So you can actually just extract that state, or create a generic button, and just pass those functions through. Make sure that it executes when a certain event happens in a different component. It can always be a bit complex at first, but it's really a handy thing to have. One reason why I said you have to make sure you pass it a value is because we can also say render tag. I'm just going to use an example here. or render hello, just as an example, which returns hello. In that case, what we can do is, if we have a value here, we can just directly execute that in our code. So this is not gonna, this is gonna try and display a function, so it's gonna error. If we do this, if we do this, so this is just gonna return hello, because it's actually executing a function in our code. While here, we're passing it as a value. So we're saying to the component, here's my function, please use it whenever onClick happens. Does that make it a bit more clear? Okay. Now, one last case is, what if you have a function that has parameters, because we don't have access to those voices? So what if I have here amount, and I'm just going to say, oh, I need to set the amount to amount. Well, I can't use that here because then I have to write this, and that's going to execute the code. And that's where that shortcut comes in, where we just say this. Because then we're just defining a new function and passing this value. So that allows us to actually pass parameters when we want to, but not execute it. This is essentially the same as if I would say, here this, and pass it as a value. That would be exactly the same thing. But I'm just defining a new function inside of my code there. So that way we can actually pass parameters if we need to, if those are static. This could be a bit complex at first, but when you start using it, it can be a bit more clear. So when you start splitting components, you're gonna see that at some point, oh, I need to do something on this onClick, on some action. My components is going to influence another component, and you have to kind of extract that function or a state or some kind of thing. That's also the reason I said that components we render when props change, because sometimes we have to actually pass a state as a prop, which makes this component we render because the props change, which is state above the component. Okay, it's a bit, like I said, complex at first, but try it. If you have any questions or any questions right now, you say so.
Probably need to do it a couple of times before.
Yeah, of course. You're going to run into issues, you're going to run into weird errors. It's fine.
So the most important is making the exercise, and the more you exercise, the more you get familiar with it, understand how it works and how the syntax is. You have to use it a couple of times to memorize it.
Because a really common thing, and that's why I'm trying to tell it a few times, is people do this and then ask, why is my code not working? Not passing the function. Because when you do that, you're saying you execute that function to React, and that's always going to go wrong. So either pass it as a value, like this, or if it needs static parameters, pass it as this. That way you can pass parameters and follow the same, and it'll be safe. Okay. Awesome. Any more questions about how this would work? Okay. Yeah, lastly, like I said, event handlers. We're going to have them in JavaScript. They used to be onClick. In React, like anything, it's canopies or not. Is canopies? Yeah. Get those confused on. And those essentially were the same thing. You have a lot of functions you can use on React, on Change, on Click, or a billion more options. The only thing I keep forgetting, there is none on hover, it's on mouse speed. And on mouse speed.
But you can find all the event handlers also in the React documentation website. Normally, there is a very good documentation. Everything explained how it works, and so all the event handlers are also there.
Exactly.
A very handy website.
Last thing is, what if a function? What if I want to pass a function that gets parameters? Might be a bit weird. Say it. Is the best way I can explain that. let's say I have a log function which gets a text. I want to console log that text. Now, we want that text to be dynamic. It's not always going to be the same thing. So we can just pass it as a log. Inside our button, we gotta make sure we do this right. Is niet meer aan. Zo, dit kan niet dus door te geven. Vanuit een klik, maar een klik enkel. Ja, de goede voorbeeld. It's a bit hard to set an example for this one. Essentially, onClick gives an event, a click event for that function. When you pass this, it's going to accept those values. So let's say if onClick, onClick will pass the event as a value, and when we just give through that value like this, that function will accept that value, no issue, and it can be used. A good example of that would be on shapes, like you said, on inputs, that will always give true values. Then you don't need to parameters.
You can use an input for the text and use two
Forms.
Yeah. So an example.
So for example, you have an input field, and you want the text you write into your HTML input field, you want to have that value, that text, in your parent component. How do you pass from your child's component the value to your parent component? And that's something we're going to show now.
Sure. Okay, so here we're going to have text. I complain that's not fine. Go. And just need to pause text. Doesn't have to do with this. Oh, it's the input. Unchanged. Oh. Okay. Change. It's not even.
Just at least if you use it.
As well as that events. Een beetje hoe zwart met geworden. Oh. Okay, there we go. So it's a bit of a better example. We have an input component which accepts a handle change prop. So that's going to execute every time our input changes. Now, when an input changes, it's going to pass through an event, and we can take a target and a value, essentially the value of that input. When we pass through that function, handle change is going to pass an event. So we don't need to actually initialize any parameters here, because handle change gives an event, and set event accepts a value. So we don't need to do any magic here. Those functions are just going to figure it out. In our text, we're going to take that event, set it up, get the target, and get that value. That's how we get those values from an HTML input. But you notice that we don't need braces or set parameters or anything, because we have one prop which is an unchange, and one function which accepts already the value. So that's going to dynamically add that value to the function. I know it's a bit confusing, but it essentially says that we don't need to do any special thing here, because we're giving an event and we're expecting an event as a value. Could be a bit complex, it's also hard to explain, so yeah. Besides that, are there any more questions regarding event handlers or passing through functions as props?
I didn't say what have connected with the input, because the event method always takes the event.
Yeah.
But I can see that from the code.
So what is your question exactly?
Maybe can you understand how events connected with set event?
Okay, so if we say here we have an input which has a handler on change.
Yes.
So that's going to execute every time that input changes. Now, an input emits an event when it changes. An event which has an object which has lots of different values, one of which is the value of that input, which you can see here. Is going to be event target value. Something you're going to see a lot when using selects or inputs in HTML.
This one I can say that there is one event question mark.
Oh, the question mark.
Actually,
Sure. A question mark in this regard is essentially saying, don't worry about this object if it doesn't exist, if it's undefined. So if I remove this, actually in this group, yeah, you'll see my crash is why, because it can't read the properties of undefined, because we don't have an event yet, because we haven't typed anything. That question mark is really handy, because it essentially says only get that property if that object is not undefined, if it's filled with something. That allows us to essentially ignore, like you see, errors there, which don't really matter. We're not expecting events the first time our component renders, only when it changes. So we can only check our event if it actually exists. That's what that question mark does.
Any kind of falsy value or just undefined?
Undefined, I believe. Only undefined. It's a bit of a shortcut to Otherwise, you might have to say an if else if that object exists, and then create another value to pass through. This is essentially is just a shortcut to say ignore it if it doesn't exist. It doesn't matter.
This code seems it looks like directly takes value from event topic value, not from the state.
Yeah, we are getting the state. The state essentially has that event. So we're capturing the event in our state. We could also simplify it to say, in going our input and change,
The
okay,
text is the first line, then the second line is included. So we directly get the event topic value, and then set the event, use set the event value to update the state. That's
yeah, we
the
can.
order around.
Yeah, we can only we would only put the text in our state. Is that what you?
I mean, here the what's the text text for is I think the text is to show what the user input, right?
Yeah. So
But what they show is come from directly read the value user new public value, not from the state.
we
I was so pleased why you say event. I was thinking first set use set event and modify update the state, then render the new state information to in text. That's
we could.
different order.
Yeah, we can absolutely change the order to only save the text or only get our value from our event and put that in the state. Only use that. It's absolutely possible. This is just for demo purposes. But yeah, I think I got a question right. If
Okay, I just finalized this answer.
no, sure. We could simplify it. Let's say if we only want the text, right? We don't want to worry about the events. What we could do is give, we can actually do that. What we can say is here, okay, I'm expecting an event from unchanged. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass to our function that's being passed on above, only pass through target value. Right? So now what we're doing is we're only going to pass that text, not the entire event, not the object. Now we do have to rename this to make our code clear. So this is now going to be, well, value, I suppose. And set value. Change all these. Set value. So now we're only expecting value, no longer the event only.
And the behavior will be the same.
Yeah, behavior.
Exactly.
This version is more readable.
Yeah, it's completely true. This is the proper way to do it. So we're only going to consume our value and not our events, entire events. You have to decide yourself, what do I want to keep in my state? Now, it's always like, it's a perfectly good question because you should always simplify your state. So don't keep entire objects if it's not necessary, sometimes it is. But if you can only save one item and everything works, save only that item. Make it as simple as possible. So this implementation, like I say, is better than keeping the entire event. That's good. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Any more questions?
In your life, you prefer to write code in first person or on the second one?
Where I write code or
In your real life, program.
Yeah.
What version?
what
you
version?
usually use? I mean, the event one or this one. You wrote
What version of the second one?
Yeah,
You're right.
this
You
one.
should Because one of the, also the rule, but the best practice is to make your code as simple as it needs to be. Don't overcomplicate things as you're using generics or small or everything. Make your code as simple as it should be. So you're absolutely right in saying we should use this because it's more readable. That's completely true. If we were in a position where we need to say, oh, I need some other value for my events, then we would save the event because we need it. But in this regard, we only need the text, so we only save the text. So the second version in this context, I will always use. Okay, everyone understands event handlers and how we pass through functions as values and props. Okay.
Maybe should we all try to create what he has created,
Yeah.
just to make it an exercise?
Good exercise to memorize the syntax.
Yeah,
And just show the workbench and
yeah.
Yeah.
Show them what you've done, and something that updates, yeah, renders whatever you put in the input. Let's try that. We will be here to help.